Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics, brought to you once again by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the cartoonist behind the upcoming Triage at Dark Horse Comics. It's Phillip Sevy. Thanks for coming on, Phillip.
Hey, man, thanks for having me. I've been a big fan of the show for a very long time, so it's a crazy cool honor to be joining as a guest.
Nice. No, thank you for coming on. You know, we're going to be talking about Triage a whole lot because it's your book that's coming out in early September. But I want to start instead. I want to talk about some of your background. And I want to start at the very first comic you made. Because when I was preparing for this, I read that your first comic you made was at the age of 4. Like,
yes.
What was it? And, like, why have I never read it? I would like to read it now.
I made 2 of them at the same time. I can't remember which one I did first. And I don't even know if they exist anymore. I'm really going to have to do some dumpster diving at my parents' house one of these days to see if I can find them. But the 2 that I made, one was a Fantastic Four comic. And I think I remember specifically doing it because at the time, all the cartoons that I would rent on VHS from Warehouse Video, it was during the era when they subbed out Human Torch and put Herbie in there because having people on fire scared kids or something.
Right.
So I drew one with Human Torch in it because I loved the Human Torch. He was such a cool visual, and it was lame that he was replaced by a dumb robot. So
right.
The other one I did was there was a Spanish import cartoon that played in the 80s called Mysterious Cities of Gold. I don't know if you remember that or if it crossed your radar where you grew up, but it was this like quest with, pyramids and temples and finding gold and a flying ship and all sorts of really cool stuff. I think Esteban was the main character. So I did a Mysterious Cities of Gold fan comic. So those are my first 2 stories.
That sounds amazing. I've never actually heard of that. What Mysterious Cities of Gold? Was that it?
Mysterious Cities of Gold. Yeah. I at one point the cartoon was on like Amazon or Netflix. I don't know if it is anymore. It's very much like a product of a time, but it was super cool. It was like a fascinating kind of serialized quest these characters went on. And as a 4 and 5-year-old, like it was my life. So.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it is funny how like in your early years, like some of the stuff you take on, it has like this outsized importance. Like when I was a kid, there was this. I feel like there's like a certain amount of regional nature to like the youthful movies that people like that really appeal to kids. There was this movie that I randomly came across called The Dirt Bike Kid. Did you ever watch that?
No, I don't think I have.
It was about this kid who like buys a dirt bike at some random place, and like effectively the guy's like, "You don't want that, it's trash." And he's like, "I don't know, it speaks to me." And then he gets it, and effectively all it is like covered in mud. And so like he cleans it up, and apparently cleaning it up makes it fly and basically have sentient life. And so I thought it was like the most incredible movie, and it also convinced me that for some reason that if I just clean things that they would like have magical powers, which my parents loved because they don't clean things all the time. But anyways, yeah, like sometimes when you're a kid, it's like you have these stories you latch onto, and your love of them doesn't make a lot of sense, but still it works out.
Yeah, exactly. And like I love that the message of that is like cleaning is good. That's a phenomenal kid propaganda tool.
It is totally. It's like just parent driven propaganda. That's all the stuff that back then was. But so you were drawing comics when you were 4, but you were also drawing like Fantastic Four comics. So clearly you were aware of like the Marvel zeitgeist to a certain degree.
Yeah, actually, let me back you up like a year and a half earlier, because my first memory as a human is when I was like 2.5 years old. My aunt was getting married, and I was like a ring bearer or something like that.
Sure.
I don't remember anything about the ceremony, but I remember sitting back down in the pew of the church after I'd finished my deeds. And as a good job or thank you, whatever, my dad reaches under the pew in front of him, and he pulls out a brown paper bag. And inside the brown paper bag was a Magneto and Iron Man Secret Wars action figures. And he gave them to me as like a good job. And that's my first memory. So I'm like pretty much pegged to comics from life. I'm glad I'm able to make a career out of it, because it's been stuck. There's no hope.
That is incredible. That's a pretty good ring bearer gift.
Yeah, it's sweet. To this day, I'm like, and I had a bunch of Secret Wars action figures after that, all growing up. So like, yeah, the Marvel guys were my jam from an early age.
So like the larger idea of comics, if not comics themselves, were those there before art for you? I mean, it was such an early age. I guess it's just kind of probably blurry to a certain degree.
Yeah, it pretty much is. Like, I mean, I remember getting those figures as a 2.5 year old, and then I remember probably somewhere in my threes or fours just playing with all of my Secret Wars action figures or some of the DC Kenner's Superpowers line. Like, I remember watching Super Friends and Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, and just every time we went to a video store, it was run over in what 60s Marvel or DC cartoon did they have in stock. And yeah, like I was hooked like from a young age.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of funny. This week we actually realized that we are 4 months apart in age because of the X-Men. Like, there was the whole meme going on Twitter where it was like, what issue of the X-Men came out when you were the month you were born? And I was 177 and you were 173, I think it is.
Yes, I think it was. Yep.
Yeah. So I know that you're an X-Men guy. I'm an X-Men guy, but I am curious as to which artists and which comics were like the thing, like the biggest foundational pieces for you in your youth. Like, which ones spoke to you the most as you were kind of moving towards being interested in drawing your own comics and everything?
Yeah, totally. I mean, like a lot of people kind of my age, I grabbed X-Men #1, the Jim Lee Chris Claremont issue.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't get it right when it came out. I think I got it about a year and a half later. I was just walking through the mall and I stumbled on a comic book store, and it was like they had stacks of them in the windows. I was like, oh my gosh, X-Men #1. By now, the Fox X-Men cartoon had premiered and whatnot. So like I convinced my mom to let me start buying comics because I was like, X-Men #1 is going to be worth so much money someday. At the time I did not understand the reason there were stacks of them in the comic store 2 years later is that, it's the #1 highest ordered comic book of all time. So it will never be worth anything because there's 8 million plus copies in circulation.
Right.
Yeah, so I took that home. I read it that night, and it didn't make a lick of sense because if you just start at the end of Claremont's 16-year run, especially towards the latter end of like Jim Lee's run, like those books are almost incomprehensible if you're not familiar with X-Men.
Mm-hmm.
But I read it and I was like, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to be a comic book artist. I'm going to channel my love of drawing and comics into this thing, and that kind of launched me forward. And I think at the time, Andy Kubert was the main artist on the book, so I started collecting kind of the monthly title. So Andy Kubert, and then shortly after him over on Academy was Joe Madureira.
Oh yeah.
And those two were like my artists. So much what I loved about comics.
So you were Kubert. I guess that would make sense, but I mean, were you Kubert over Jim Lee?
No, Jim was like, my #1, and probably still to this day is one of my favorite artists of all time. But I think by then he had left and he was launching Wildcats over at Image. And I think it took me a couple more years to pick those up. The Image books were a little bit older as far as the kind of their target audience, or at least for me, I was just like, I'll buy anything with an X on it. And he wasn't drawing anything with an X on it at the time. So it took me a couple of years to be like, oh, that guy made another comic. I should get that.
Yeah. I actually think I can top you in terms of incomprehensible first comics that you bought, at least in the X-Men realm. So X-Men 1 was at least a first issue. My first comic that I bought, and I distinctly remember this because it was one of the polybagged ones that had a card inside of it.
Oh, Extinction Agenda?
No, it was Executioner's Song.
Executioner's Song. Yes, sorry.
Yeah.
I mean, they're all X something or other.
I know. Yeah. I love that. It's such a charming thing that X-Men Comics did. But it was Uncanny X-Men 294, the first issue of the Executioner's Song event.
Yes.
And it had like Cable standing over Professor X, and he'd shot him in the chest with some sort, like a techno-organic virus bullet thing, except for it was actually Strife in reality, as I found out later.
Yes.
And it was
man.
It was like drinking from a fire hose of continuity, because like I think like half the characters in the story were clones or time traveling in some way.
Yes, and to this day, I point to Executioner Song as like my favorite X-Men crossover all time. Not because it's the best, but because it was happening right at pretty much the same time I came in as well.
Yeah.
And so it took me like 2 years to collect every issue, because you just there wasn't like a great checklist or an internet, or even I didn't start getting Wizard magazine until a couple of years later to know like, all right, which book is next. But oh my gosh, yeah, it's one of the most insane crossovers ever, and I love it so much. And especially with Cable, the way it finally links his backstory, which for me it was all new, but it had been brewing in X-Men comics for 4 or 5 years at that point, and it's just it's such an insane book in like the best way humanly possible.
Mm-hmm. My big event from that period was actually shortly after that. I don't even know. like I feel like this had to be a fairly early graphic novel for Marvel. I mean, they were doing some stuff in like the late 80s and early 90s, but I got the Extinction Agenda one, and I still have it to this day. I tried to get Jim Lee to sign it when he was at Emerald City a few years ago, but it was a ticketed only thing. But I've read that so many times that book is like straight up falling apart. I mean, it is just tatters, but I love that one. Like, there's so many things that I remember that's like really specifically, like memories that are specifically tied to like story beats in that. It's really funny how that stuff works out. But I mean, that was Jim Lee, that was Rob Liefeld, and it was, oh my God, John Bogdanove. I think that was
right. Yes.
Yeah. And that was, I mean, I remember like to this day, I find Cameron Hodge to be horrifying just because he was like that big, like robot version of him. It was so gross.
Yes.
But anyways, I did want to talk about the fact that, it seems like, one of the things I talked to, people who eventually became comic artists or even working in comics is like, there is this idea in people's heads that like, these just magically came out, and it's like it took people a bit to even realize that this is a job that you could have. But it seemed like you kind of jumped onto that pretty early on, that you knew you wanted to draw comics. Was it just because you loved them so much, or what was it about drawing comics that was so appealing to you?
I think from an early age, and this ties into kind of the first comics I made, but like our family, we were always big on like movies and not necessarily TV shows, because they weren't as big as they are today, but movies, especially, like stories, were important. And I, more so than any other type of media, really connected to stories and kind of the power that storytelling has. I feel for a very long time as a kid and as an adolescent and even as too young adult, like I was very emotionally closed off. But at the same time, like I would get emotional when I watched a movie or I read a book or something like that. Like that tapped into areas that I wasn't comfortable with kind of in reality. So it was, obviously the art was phenomenal, but it was like a way to tell a story in a way that I could do, in quotations, because like I can draw, I can tell a story this way. I didn't have a video camera. Video cameras were a lot more expensive back then. And I didn't have, wasn't writing novels at the time or anything, but like comics were something that I could do that could tell a story, that could help, elicit an emotion. It was like, I want to be involved in something that means so much to me, and has such a profound effect on me. I still remember reading, I think it's Uncanny X-Men 303, with Scott Lobdell wrote it and Richard Bennett drew it. It was the issue where Ilyana died of the legacy virus. Mm-hmm. And it's funny, I will get emotional talking about it to this day. But I think I was 9 when I read that issue, 9-year-old reading, like, there's a really fascinating poeticism to the way in which X-Men comics were written. And obviously that starts with Chris Claremont, but every writer who followed after him for the next 5 or 10 years really took to that very grandiose purple prose style of writing. And if you go back and read that book, like the way that Lobdell describes kind of the emotions and conflicted feelings that Jubilee feels as this little girl who doesn't even speak English, that she doesn't even know, dies, and then trying to process those emotions and understand like what does this mean and how do we go on and what does this mean for life, and seeing how people like Kitty and Colossus and Jean and even the professor reacted. And just like I said, we're close to 25, 30 years later, and that's a book that just the impact that it made on me was like, wow, this is what comics can do. And you look a couple of issues later when, Colossus leaves the X-Men to join the Acolytes and the Fatal Attractions crossover. And because of his grief, like he doesn't turn back into a skin form for like a year or two, because, he's bottled up those emotions and he's trying to be hard on the outside just to weather just the tragedy of losing his sister to this essential AIDS virus stand-in and all those things at the time. Like it was just like that's I think why comics appealed to me so much, is not only could I draw, but it was a way to tell a story that meant something to me. And I was like, man, maybe I can do something that will have a similar impact to someone somewhere, and just to kind of be a part of it.
Yeah, no, I have to say one thing about the comics you just talked about. Speaking of the power of those comics, I actually like when you talk about Colossus joining like the Acolytes and everything like that. I still feel betrayed to this day. I'm just like, I know why he did it, but I'm just like, how dare you? And eventually that whole thing led into Wolverine having his adamantium pulled out, which was like the single most like haunting moment in comic book history in my mind, just because I can still remember those emotions. I'm like, how is this happening? What is happening? And then like Xavier like mind wipes Magneto and everything, which eventually leads to Onslaught, yada yada yada. I don't know, and like that was the other thing too, is like the interconnectivity of those stories back then and how they all kind of fed into each other eventually. Like maybe they didn't do it as well as Claremont did, but I still think like the 90s comics were pretty good at pipelining from one step to another, and even playing cards now that'll eventually pay off a few years later. Like that stuff was really kind of amazing.
It really was. I think 90s comics generally get a bad rap. And, there are things that it's just and it's deserving. But I think, and I hope in time, as we're able to look back, and now that like I have so many, every time there's a new omnibus collection of that run or that era, I have to buy it, that people can begin to appreciate it, kind of just, the genius of it. And, comics didn't sell millions of copies at the time on a lark. There was a reason. And it wasn't just because Watchmen was good 10 years earlier. It was because they were doing really kind of groundbreaking, innovative work, and sometimes it's rough and clunky, but they were still pushing the genre and medium in very interesting ways.
So that was obviously a very art-centric era, because, I mean, we already talked about Kubert, we talked about Jim Lee, we talked about Madureira. I mean, that was, I mean, like, Adam Kubert on Wolverine, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Those are, I'm sure, all hugely formative artists for you. Was that period, like, when you start working on something like Triage, where you're writing and drawing yourself, do you feel like that style of writing kind of plays a part in like the way that you like to approach storytelling as well?
Yeah, with Triage, it was an interesting thing in that when I was trying to come up with the idea and put together the pitch, I very much came from a place of wanting to do a book that was so comic that it couldn't be described as anything else. Like there's lots of amazing comics that you're like, oh my gosh, this would make a great TV show, or oh my gosh, this would be a really good film. I think sometimes people pejoratively speak about like, oh, that book's just a pitch for something or other. And I don't think that's necessarily exactly. It's not always a negative thing. There's great books out there that translate easily into other medium. But for this one, I'm like, I want to do something that's like so 100% comic that like a Hollywood guy would look at the book and be like, I don't know what to do with it. Which, from a creator-owned standpoint, probably not the best move I'll make in my career, because that's a good avenue, a revenue stream. But I want to do something that was comic book, and that very much is not an homage, but like almost, I guess an homage to just the insanity of comics and like the breadth of storytelling that you can do, and how much you can plug into a book that just pushes kind of, like we were talking about with X-Men and Cable and things like that. Like that couldn't be done anyway. Like I really enjoy Deadpool 2. I think it's a great movie, and they did a really fun job with Cable, but that's not, Nathan Christopher Summers, who was born from Cyclops and Jean Grey's clone Madeline Pryor, who was given a techno-organic virus, who was taken into the future and raised by a Ascani's son and cloned and made, I just go on and on, like this crazy, ambitious style of storytelling. And now with Triage, it's a 5-issue miniseries, so I can't do 5 years worth of X-Men stories in one, but it was that I want to do something that pushes the boundaries and pays homage to the excitement and feeling you got as a kid or as a teenager reading comics, when you were just like, I cannot believe this. Like Cable and Strife are the same person. What? Right. Just something like that just kind of returns that almost childlike innocence and excitement to comics. And it's not that it's not there. It is, but I wanted specifically to make a book that tries to elicit those feelings of nostalgia and excitement you had when you picked up books really early on in your comic reading career.
Yeah, I mean, the X-Men are a perfect example for all of that, because, like you were saying about with Cable and Strife and everything like that, the more you think about it, the more insane it is. But it kind of worked. I wouldn't say despite that. I think it worked because of that. I mean, it's just like you look at, like something like Jane Miles Explain the X-Men. The reason why that is, I can't speak to why they're successful, but I feel like a big part of it is because two things. One, the X-Men are completely insane. And two, their level of insanity actually like inspires a lot of passion, because it's just like, I don't know. I think people appreciate stories that really go for it, and I feel like the X-Men never really they didn't take a whole lot of plays off. They always were going for it.
It's true. It's 100% true.
Well, we'll get back to Triage here in a bit, but I want to talk about what came next for you, because I read on your bio, one of the things that I thought was really interesting is you went to SCAD, but before you went to SCAD, you actually made your own webcomic, Heartless Dark, which you did entirely yourself, seemingly besides lettering. And I mean, you might have done that as well. But I find that really, that's like an interesting process, because it's like, normally I guess I would think, you would have an interest in comics or interest in art, and then you would go to school, and then comics would come out of it. But you were on the comic train before then. So how did Heartless Dark come out? And like, I guess like, were you just always looking for a way to release your own stories, and like that was just kind of an outlet for you?
Yeah, so it's actually even a little bit more of a crazier story than that. I because of the '90s, kind of the collapse of the comics market, a lot of comic stores around me disappeared. And it took a couple years before I was in a new area. I grew up in California, and there was some shops around me, and I got back into comics. So in my teens, that's when I started putting together like portfolios and submissions and stuff like that. And I would travel to San Diego Comic-Con every year with my oversized portfolio case, and force myself to sit in as many portfolio review lines as possible. I had a lot of anxiety, and still do a little bit, about just kind of cold approaching people, and essentially interrupting whatever they were doing. But I think my first portfolio I showed was in 1999.
Wow.
I had a sample I did, which is horrendous. I think it's on my website somewhere. I should repost it on Twitter so everyone can laugh. It was like Dave Finch's Ascension was like my favorite book at the time from Top Cow. So I did some Ascension pages, and I was like, all I want to do is get a job with Top Cow. So I met with the editor there, and I have never been more thrashed in my life in a portfolio review than that meeting as a 15-year-old. I remember like sitting in the hallway shaking afterwards, being like, maybe I should take up golf. Like I'm not even good at golf, but maybe I'll be better at it than this.
I was going to say, golf is very specific. I was like, did you play golf at the time?
Yeah, I have no idea why. I was just like, it was like maybe something crazy I'll be better at, because apparently I'm not very good at this.
Right.
So I showed up, went for a handful of years in a row from like 15 to 19, showing my portfolio around. And I would occasionally put together a sample between Comic Cons and mail it out. I've got a handful of like rejection letters from all the companies at the time. And then, a variety of things happened. Life got in the way. This kind of ties into Triage later, so I'll drop this in. Generally, I don't talk too much about religion, but I grew up a very devout Mormon. So from 19 to 21, I went and was a missionary in Tennessee. So during those times, I wasn't really drawing or collecting comics. And then when I got back, I just was, I hit a place of fear. Like, maybe I can't do this. Maybe I'll never be good enough. Like I allowed fear to kind of lock up my creative ambitions. And I got my bachelor's degree in corporate finance. I got a job working for Goldman Sachs right before the market crash of 2008. And then I worked for them for a couple years. And it was while I was working for them for a couple years, by this point I was married, we had a house, kind of like all these life responsibilities. I started to realize like I do not function well unless I'm finding a creative outlet, a way to tell stories, a way to kind of express. So I wrote a lot during those years, screenplays and short stories and other things like that. And that's kind of how I got around to a webcomic, because I was like, I have all these stories piling up, but I just have no way of getting them out there. The economy of the country was in the toilet, especially California, because at one point I was like, maybe I'll move to California and try and get a break in as a screenwriter or something like that. But California was a rough place to get to at the time. So I think at the time I was reading Freak Angels, the Warren Ellis Paul Duffield webcomic that was free.
Yeah.
I stumbled across webcomics. I mean, they'd been around for a while, but I'd never noticed them before. I was still buying comics every month. I had been this entire time, even when I wasn't really actively trying to pursue comics. But I stumbled, Freak Angels, and I had a story that I'd been writing for a couple of years, which is what Heartless Dark became. Mm-hmm. And I had a friend of mine call me up. He's like, dude, why don't you just do a webcomic? Right around the same time I was thinking maybe I should do a webcomic. And I just dove kind of headfirst in. I had a good friend help build a website, and I had started breaking this story down into scripts. And I think at the beginning I was writing, penciling, and inking it. And I was also like gray toning it with markers. And then I had a friend who was coloring and lettering it, my friend Alma Madsen. And then really quickly I took over flatting for him, and then I just kind of took over colors. And we posted 5 pages a week for a year and a half straight. We didn't ever miss a scheduled update. So when the story concluded, it was like 330 some odd pages long.
That's incredible.
And it was one big long form story, and you would be hard pressed to find it anymore. I kind of took everything down after I'd been in comics for a while because I didn't want someone Googling my name and coming like, what is this terrible art? This guy's awful. But yeah, like, it was a big accomplishment there. And in doing that, it got me back into like making comics and going to conventions and showing my work around. And that's how I got introduced to SCAD, the Savannah College of Art and Design. And they have the oldest comic book degree rewarding program in the country. So I applied and went there, and I got my MFA in sequential art from 2010 to 2012. So I quit the corporate job. We moved across the country for a few years and just kind of did a 180 degree on a career in life. And it's kind of set me on this path to here. Yeah.
I was going to say, like, I'm guessing you're the only person in comics who worked for Goldman Sachs at some point in their life, but I could be mistaken about that. You know, you had a pretty good idea as to how to make a comic by the time you went to SCAD. I mean, you have to learn a lot when you're doing 330 plus pages over a period of a year and a half. That's just an immense amount of comics.
Yeah.
How did the art school experience like impact you? Because I mean, I have to imagine, if anything, it was helping you refine and figure out exactly what you're doing with your sequential art.
Oh, very much so. Like, you know, having spent a couple years outside of undergrad before coming back for a graduate degree, I was a good 3 to 4 years at least older than all my other peers in my program. So I felt behind the ball when I had like 22-year-old kids who were like so much better than I was. And I was like, you know, I think 27 at the time, and I was like just garbage. But yeah, I think I love art school. I'm a huge proponent of education. Not necessarily that everyone has to go to an art school, but I learned as I was older, I was able to reflect, like in my 20s, older, but in my 20s, I was like, oh, okay. So I drew samples year after year as a teenager, and I never really got better because I wasn't studying. I was just drawing to draw. Mm-hmm. And I realized like, oh, like when people would be like, oh, work on perspective or anatomy, in my head as a teenager, I'd be like, oh, okay, I'll just keep drawing more stuff. And that was how I'll work on it. When I was missing a piece that I kind of learned just in college in general was how to educate yourself and how to study and how to get better. And so that's why I went to SCAD. It was like, I know my learning style does not lend itself well to like, I will pick up a book, I will sit down, I will read this book, and I will become better by reading it. Ryan Otley is a good friend of mine, and we've talked a lot about this. And Ryan bought comics and bought books and taught himself how to draw, and he's one of the best damn artists in the industry. If I could have done that, I would have loved to save myself the time and money, but I just couldn't figure it out. So going to, but I also knew that like from a school environment, if I have one person show me how to do it, then I can take off from there. And that's what SCAD was for me, was just having a lot of great instructors sit down and help me understand what it was I was doing wrong and how to do it right. And by the time I was done, I felt the best skill I gained while I was there was the ability to teach myself. So from there on out, anytime, and it's constantly, as an artist, you're constantly like, crap, I got to get better at, like an eyeball. Like my eyeballs were fine for a while, but now I realize we need to do better eyeballs. So now I know like how I can break things down and figure out what's wrong and hopefully get better and what resources to turn to. So that's kind of what the art school experience meant for me. Like I was really good at buckling down and getting stuff done and time management. I had to, because I was working 50 to 70 hours a week at the corporate job and still having to crank out 5 full comic pages a week. So I was all good at like, buckling down and getting it done, but I needed that ability to help me kind of step up to the next level and then to go from there and figure out how to fill in the gaps that I encounter. So
it was really like you knew you had the work ethic, you knew you had the interest. It was just refining that into like the skills you needed and like the storytelling you needed to accomplish to get there.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I am kind of curious, did you, your fuel when you were younger was Kubert, Lee, Madureira, everything like that. Mm-hmm. Were obviously a big part of figuring this all out. When you're at SCAD, is you're probably reading and looking at a lot of artists, not just in comics but beyond. Was there anyone in particular that helped you kind of unlock this next step for you when you were in SCAD? Like in any artists where you like discovered them and you're like, oh, okay, this really helps me understand where I need to go.
Yeah, I think, from Lee and stuff like that, there was a couple of steps along the way. As a teenager, it was guys like Mike Turner and Dave Finch. I very much just ate their work up. And even when I started SCAD, I showed my portfolio so Tom Lyle is instructor there. Tom did Batman and Spider-Man and all sorts of stuff in the 90s. And Tom looked at it and he goes, "You like Mike Turner, huh?" And I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "It's like, this looks like a terrible Mike Turner." He's like, "Stop trying to draw like him." And I was like, "You're right." So it was, a lot of it was like breaking those shackles of like those influences, having those influences, but not trying to be those influences. So while I was in SCAD, I discovered, or not just discovered, but I looked closely at artists like Stuart Immonen or Sean Gordon Murphy. Those were two that were huge for me at the time. Sarah Pichelli was another one that was getting really big. And then shortly after SCAD, kind of doing deep dives into artists like Stuart, and also Chris Somney taught me so much about storytelling. It's not even funny. Or Humberto Ramos, who I'd been a fan of my entire life, but really breaking down how he gets dynamics and energy into his forms and figures and things like those were a couple artists I know along the way that really just kind of really helped me break some of the bad habits and understand new things.
Yeah.
But I mean, I could walk to my bookcase and just list like every artist I love. It would be an artist appreciation thread. But those are some of the ones I know. Like I had big breakthroughs studying kind of what they did. From the comic book side of things, yeah.
When I was a kid, I actually wanted to be a comic artist, and the one that I studied above all was Humberto. And
so good.
The problem was I was unable to actually convert like the enthusiasm and the appreciation of his stuff into actually something that was worthwhile. But man, his impulse stuff, that was like the thing that was everything for me when I was 11 years old. Well, just a few more questions before we fully get into Triage. Near as I can tell, your big break was, and this would be a really big break given the fact you always wanted to work for Top Cow, is you were Top Cow Talent Hunt runner-up in 2014, and you eventually did a fair amount of work for Top Cow. How did that impact your career? Was that like a really excellent foot in the door, or do you feel like you were already kind of getting there before that moment happened?
No, I definitely feel like I owe my career and my big break to the people at Top Cow, who I very much love. They're like a part of my family, it feels like. But yeah, like I had done a 4-issue miniseries for Action Lab called The First Hero, which came out in 2014, but I drew it in 2013. I think I had met Matt Hawkins at San Diego Comic-Con in 2013, and I showed him my stuff. And he's like, "Hey, man, we got this talent hunt going on." It's like, "This stuff's good. This stuff is good as anything that won last year. Submit." So I did, and I was a runner-up. So it would have been the 2014 talent hunt. I think Isaac Goodhart, who's drawing, he drew Postal, and now, he's drawing the new Catwoman graphic novel. He was the winner that year, and the winner on the writer's side was Teenie Howard. I was surrounded by just like amazing talent who's just taken off from then, and they're I consider them very good friends. But yeah, it was I entered it, and it was a runner-up. I got to write back up. I got to draw an 8-page story that was written by then assistant editor Ryan Cady, who's now drawing Infinite Dark, and he did a Venom annual this week and all sorts of crazy cool stuff. So right from the get-go, I was surrounded by people we are all about the same level in the industry and just super talented, excited, cool people.
I was going to say that, like, I actually think this stuff might exist still, but I always felt like the Top Cow talent hunt, and then there was things like I don't know if you remember, they did like Chester Quest, where CB Cebulski was going around trying to find like international artists, and it was like this whole thing.
Oh, that's right.
And that's where Sarah Pichelli came from. That's where a lot of people came from in that era. And I don't know, I always felt like that was such a great inroad for new artists, because a lot of times it's like, you know, one of the big questions is like, how do you break in? And these are like literal, like, you know, getting your foot in the door, like, experiences. Like those are like the perfect way to do it. And I don't know, I always thought the Top Cow thing was pretty sweet.
I think I really would love to see more companies take advantage of those talent hunts and opportunities. I know Top Cow's done quite a few since then. And I know it's a lot of work for the people over there and the editorial staff to sift through hundreds of submissions. And, you know, I can only imagine how disheartening it can be as an editor to have to reject hundreds of people.
Oh, yeah.
But, you know, they've discovered that's how a lot of us broke in and kind of got our first foot in the door. And not only that, started to build these communities, these networks of peers is, you know, I think the idea of networking is sometimes this, like, I'm going to walk into a party and I'm going to go shake Tom King's hand and be like, "I am Phillip. We should network and be friends and work on a project." When in reality, that's not networking at all. You're not going to network with the top people when you're starting. Who you need to find are the people who are sitting next to you in portfolio review lines, or who are in that How to Break Into Comics the Marvel Way panel. Like, you need to find those people who are at the same level, and you'll all work kind of together moving forward. And that's what the Top Cow Talent Hunt did. That's what, going to school with SCAD did. It took me a long time to understand the importance of peer networks, and how much that not only helps your career, but helps you as a human. Like, I have people that I talk to every single day when I have a hard time, or I'm struggling, or I can't figure something out. I've got a really great network of people who are all around the same place. I can be like, what's wrong? Can you help me out here? Or, I can't understand this. And I think things like that are super important. And we don't see as much of them, but I would like to continue to see more of them.
Yeah. I mean, I actually, the big thing about the peer groups too is you have people with common experiences, like people that you can share things with. And I think that, because, I mean, I'm not saying that somebody that like came up as an artist in 1998 won't get somebody who's coming up now to a certain degree. But I talked to Steve Lieber about this a little, a fair bit on when he came on the podcast recently. And we were really just talking about how much things are changing today. And it's good to have other people to bounce ideas off of, and to make sure that, you're really like all jiving together. Like, you have people that understand where you're coming from. And that's why I think that the peer group is so important.
Yes, no, I 100% agree.
The last question before Triage, I want to ask about Tomb Raider, because when I was doing, one of the things that, like, I everyone has their kind of fandoms, and as a person who, like, I played the like Tomb Raider games back in the day on like PlayStation, but at the same time I don't have like a deep affinity for the larger Lara Croft mythology or anything like that, or if there is a Lara Croft mythology. But the interesting thing is like, when I was reading interviews with you, like I found one that was on like a Tomb Raider specific site, like that is like a significant fandom, and like that was a pretty big license book. It was a 12-issue run. You did it with Mariko Tamaki, who is like incredible. Do you feel like that project in particular was a notable, or maybe an impactful one, just because it was like a notable license project? It had a big writer attached to it. It had all these things, or was it just kind of, I don't know, am I potentially overstating its impact?
No, definitely not at all. I've been doing some work for Top Cow, and there was an editor at Dark Horse I'd known for about 2.5 years. And I just send him stuff every now and then. We check in at shows. And I was 2 issues into a 4-issue run on the Tithe, and I sent him just a couple issues that I'd done recently. Like, hey, man, just sending out recent work. Hope things are good. And he hit me back up like the next day, and he's like, what are you doing like right now? I have something really big that I think you'd be great for. So he called me up. And he was like, we're relaunching Tomb Raider, and I want you to draw it. And I was like, Top Cow, Mike Turner kid.
Right.
Now the license is with Dark Horse. But I'm like, yes, 100%. I don't care. Like, I will draw it. And he's like, yeah, Mariko Tamaki's going to write it. She just won the Eisner for this one summer, like a month and a half earlier. And I immediately went out and bought that book. I hadn't read it yet, but I was like, I knew of it. Went and read it the next day. And yeah, like I talked to him at like 7:00 that night, and the next morning I had like scripts in my inbox, and I was like, okay, we're doing this. And it was really a phenomenal experience to work on a book for 12 issues, to work with a writer. I credit Mariko as like one of the most generous writers I've worked with, because her scripts, she allowed me so much kind of freedom to try and experiment with different things, and to go crazy in layouts, and hopefully not hang myself too much in situations that I get myself into. But she was awesome. The Tomb Raider, it was a great project to work on. I'd say we did 12 issues, and then about a year and a half later, I came back for 4 more issues with Jackson Lansing and Colin Kelly writing it. And like, yeah, Tomb Raider has been so much fun. And I was worried, right? Like, you have a fandom like that where it's a big character. I was working on her when we hit the 20th anniversary of the first Tomb Raider game. And I was worried, like, there are certain fandoms out there that are just brutal on the people who work on them. I have friends who've worked on franchises where they just get torn apart by fans 24/7. But the Tomb Raider community are seriously like some of the best people. Like, there are people in that community I consider friends that I talk to still regularly. I ran into 1 or 2 of them at San Diego this year, and it was a really great experience. And like I said, it's a really high profile character. Even if you haven't read the comic book, I can be like, you guys know Tomb Raider? And everyone pretty much says yes. So yeah, it was a really, really cool and next step, and really great for, just to get a little bit more visibility and to work on kind of a really cool legacy character. Yeah,
that was one of the big things I was going to mention, was just the visibility, because it seems like, especially during a 20th anniversary, there's going to be a lot of attention there. And that's, I'm not saying that you want to just specifically pick projects or anything because of that type of thing, but it certainly helps.
Yeah, very much so. Like they did big art books during the time that I got to have like I had like more art in an art book than like Andy Park did, and I was like, Andy Park's like the definitive Tomb Raider artist, but because I was working on it at the time, like they used a bunch of the pages from the book in their giant hardcover and other big events like that. It was like crazy to be a part of it and get to meet. I got to meet Camilla Luddington and Andy Park and a bunch of people working on the video games and comics throughout the year. It was just super cool. I'm nobody and have done almost nothing, and yet I get to stand here and be involved in people who are so legendary in this franchise and character.
That's rad. All right, well, let's talk about Triage. I'm going to give you the cruelest thing you can do to a podcast guest. It's a title you're writing and drawing yourself at Dark Horse. As we talked about before we started recording, it has a great pitch to it, but at the same time, it's like you almost can't pitch it too much just because you don't want to reveal like things that you find out in the first issue, because like tying into the nostalgia of that you were trying to evoke with this. It's like for me, I was actually thinking about this the other day. Like, I don't know if you remember when like Onslaught was getting revealed and everything like that. Despite the fact that he looked like gigantic Magneto, I was always like, oh my God, who is he? I can't figure it out. This is blowing my mind. I have to know. I was always speculating. But I mean, like, having that experience of like being genuinely surprised in a comic is almost rare these days because of the way it's promoted. Your comic has a first issue reveal that you don't want to touch on. So I'm going to challenge you. What is your pitch on the book? What is it all about if you're not able to talk about the twist in the first issue?
Sure. Yeah. No, I've been doing a little bit of practice work on this. But the Triage is a 5-issue miniseries. It's a sci-fi action adventure soap opera is kind of the way best to describe it. It follows our main character, whose name is Evie Pierce. Evie is a nurse. She's hit a point in her life and her career where she's accomplished everything she wanted to, everything she set out to do. And yet when she gets there, she's not happy. And it becomes like a giant identity crisis for her, not knowing who she is anymore, or if she was ever someone to begin with. And in the middle of all this, she wakes up in this psychedelic, Ditko-esque sci-fi landscape alongside like a brassy superhero named Orbit and a hardened post-apocalyptic warrior named Marco. And they find out they've been targeted for death by this being called the Hunter. Hunter's like this unstoppable killing machine, kind of Terminator-esque, I guess you could say. Mm-hmm. And if Hunter manages to kill all three of them, all existence ends. So they have to figure out how to survive, how to defeat him, who they are to each other, why they are important to existence. And it kind of just goes from there in all sorts of crazy, as wild and as dense as I can make it type directions.
Wow. I feel like you've done that before. You're very well. that was really well done. I mean, honestly, like that is one of those funny questions that always kind of leads to panic. I feel like to a certain degree when you're on a podcast, because it's like, oh man, I have to actually pitch this book. This is tough. This is tough.
Yeah. I've been thinking about it, and thankfully, I've done a handful of little interviews here and there, and it's given me a chance to like workshop the material to see what works and what doesn't. Well,
that was, one of the interesting things about this book is it feels like a pretty robust world. It feels like you have this pretty grandiose idea around it, but it actually was a pretty recent idea for you, which I find to be. It seems like when I was reading interviews with you, it seemed like you kind of. It was like somebody asked you, was like, hey, you got anything? And you're like, oh yeah, I got something. And then next thing, like a year later, you're doing it. Like, what was the development process like? And why did you want to take on so much of the book yourself?
Yeah. So like you mentioned, I'm writing, I'm penciling, I'm inking, and I'm coloring the book. I've got Frank Vetkovic on letters, and Frank saves my life every time I send him art when he sends me work back. But yeah, like last year at San Diego Comic-Con, we were leading up to the show, and my editor on Tomb Raider is Megan Walker, and Megan is phenomenal. Another person that keeps me sane every day. And she told me, like, we're wrapping up Tomb Raider. I don't have as many comics on my deck right now. Like Dark Horse does lots of amazing art books and things like that. So she was working on a couple of those. She said, why don't you pitch me some ideas at the show? So I had 1 or 2 pitches ready to go for San Diego. And a lot of these pitches were tailored for specific companies or for specific things. But I was like, I should probably have one more pitch in my back pocket just in case. So like literally 4 days before the show, I came up with this idea. And a lot of it came from just my love of different genres of comics. I talked about, nostalgia and craziness, but another one visually was like, all right, I want to draw a superhero comic, and I love post-apocalyptic stuff, and I love crazy sci-fi, and I love like soap opera. I'm like, how can I find a comic that puts all of these together in one so I can just draw like everything I want to draw? And I came up with the idea. I designed the three main characters, and I had a rambling paragraph of an idea, and that's all I brought with me to San Diego. So when I sat down to talk to Megan, I had a couple other projects that I was like, these are the ones I'm going to show her. But I was like, yeah, what the hell? I'll show her Triage too. And I showed her, and she was like, that's cool. She's like, write it down and send it to me. So I put the images in a PDF with like, my paragraph written down. It's the ugliest pitch document that exists to man. One of these times I'll show it and spread it around. But it was all just like bare bones, get the information across. And, within a month, she emails me back. And I think it will actually be like a year to the day the first issue comes out. Coincidentally enough, is when I got the email where she was like, it's approved. You got 5 issues and a trade. And I was like, oh, okay. Now I need to make this a real thing.
That's pretty incredible. I will say I would much rather have an effective pitch than an attractive pitch.
Yeah. I guess, yeah, she somehow made this, convinced everyone it was effective. So
yeah. Oh, clearly it was. But I don't know. I think it's one of the interesting things to me is it's a very diverse book too. And I thought that was kind of an interesting aspect to it. Like, what made you decide to go that route?
Yeah, I've thought a lot about this question because I was like, someone's going to ask me this question, and I need to make sure that my answer is hopefully intelligent and eloquent enough that I don't, it doesn't come across wrong. So here's my best way to approach this. The three main leads of the book are all female, and the main character has a girlfriend. So obviously we're playing. There's a lot of not me, right? I'm just like a straight boring white guy. But I feel when you're working on books, I felt like my responsibility is to include representation and diversity of characters, of ideas, of everything, in that it feels like the real world around us. I think there's two different important ways to tell a story when it comes to representation and diversity. And one is, the people who tell stories from personal experience. And those resonate and are super powerful and help us understand the human experience better. I'm not going to write a book that is specifically about like a young girl coming out to her family and coming to terms with her sexual orientation. Like, that is not my experience, and I feel it would be cheapened if I were trying to just fictionalize a real personal experience. And I think those who come from those backgrounds and experiences, like, their stories are important, and their stories help other people understand the differences and yet similarities between us. On the flip side, I think the important thing with the stories you do is to include diversity and representation in a way that, yeah, like, that's how it is. It's there in our story. I'm not gonna necessarily highlight things or spend a lot of time focusing on it, because the truth and reality is diversity is all around us. It's a normal part of the world, and it's there's nothing that I feel. I'm trying to, what's the best way to say this? I feel like that's the best thing I can do in my stories, is include the diversity and representation that I see around us and that I want to see in my media, and that I want my friends and family and children and everything to learn and to know and to understand, but not in a way that I'm trying to tell someone else's story. Like, the characters are who they are, and the relationship they have are who they are, and that's how it is. That's the story I'm telling, and it's just part of the world, and it's normalized in that way. So that's why I felt like what I could do. Hopefully I explained that okay. Like,
you totally nailed it.
Like,
okay. Honestly, like, seriously, like, your explanations for everything are like staggeringly great. So good job, Phillip. Very good job.
Oh, thank you.
but I do want to say, like, that's one of the things. I don't want to make this a big thing, but that's one of the ideas there. Let's just say that there's a certain contingent on the comics internet who is not fond of these types of things. And that's what, like, one of the things that always like staggers me about them is just like diversity is part of the world. Like, what are you even thinking of? That's why it's like, when those types of ideas are introduced into narratives, it shouldn't be a big deal, because in our world, in a lot of ways, it isn't a big deal. And it's just like, I don't know. I thought you actually handled it very well in the first 2 issues. I've read the prologue in the first 2 issues so well, or so far. And you handle it in the exact way you said that you were hoping to. So again, good job by you.
Oh, thank you. We were talking about kind of impact of stories, and I look back on, I was a huge fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer growing up. It's one of my all-time favorite shows. I've seen it a ridiculous amount of times, but I remember, in season 4, as the character of Willow comes out as a lesbian and starts a relationship with Tara, as like a 15-year-old super conservative like kid, like it made me very uncomfortable, and it made me have to think about, why is this making me uncomfortable and what biases do I have? And it took me quite a few years to kind of to kind of sift through those things, and I feel come out on the better side of things to kind of break some of those cultural messages that I was fed for a very long time in my life. But I look back at that again, the power of story, and if that had not been there, would I have come across media that challenged me in that way, that caused me to look at what biases do I have and think about people around me, and not just as ideas or stereotypes, but as actual individual humans and kind of the experiences and emotions they go through. So I look to those touchstones that affected me very much, and try and find my own ways to do a similar thing.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, like I think stories help. I mean, ultimately, like if you're an effective story, that stories will help people understand certain things, maybe about themselves, maybe about the world around them. I mean, like a great example for me is like Tilly Walden's On a Sunbeam. Like that book helped. I would say that I hope that I was already, doing my best to understand like a certain part of the world, but I feel like Tilly Walden's work really just kind of unlocked things for me quite a bit. And I really appreciate when stories do that so well. But, this kind of ties in nicely to one of the main themes of the story, and that's identity. And that, I'm not going to get too far into that because like that's spoiler territory, but there are questions of identity that the main character has to ask herself for a number of reasons. What made this theme something you wanted to tap into? Because it seems really at the heart of the entire story, even if it is also like a pretty badass, like parallel Earth with a hunter murder robot after them and everything type story.
So I have those fun aspects of it that get me excited, or got me excited to pitch it and start drawing it. But whenever I work on a project, especially if I'm writing it, I need to find something that I tap into personally, that keeps me motivated and working every single day on a project. I've been working on this project coming up on like 10 months now. And to me, those themes of identity, obviously I talked about working in finance and switching careers entirely. And there's part of that in Evie's like recollection of like, oh no, I did what I'm supposed to do and now I'm miserable. What do I do now? But the themes of identity and the kind of emotional connection comes from situations in my life. I talked about growing up, kind of devout conservative Mormon. And in the last 5 or 6 years, I've really transitioned and left the faith behind. And in doing so, and it's a really fascinating and interesting experience looking back or looking objectively at it, but in the throes of it, coming out of such a kind of complete enclosed cultural identity, where, everything I am or do seems to be tied in some way to the religion and church community I was raised in. And that I'm not trying to necessarily speak poorly or negatively. Like there's so many positive aspects of the culture and religion I was raised in. It just got to a point where like there was too many conflicting things as I got to know other and different types of people. But as I left that behind, I was suddenly like my entire identity, which I didn't realize was so closely tied to this one aspect, was kind of broken to pieces. I didn't know, like, am I a good person? What makes a good person? Am I going to hell? Am I not going to hell? Like how am I going to define who I am now that I don't have these things that I realized had defined so many aspects of me? So it left me in a very like vulnerable and lost place for quite a while, that I had to redefine everything about me on my own terms, which at the time was a terrifying and really difficult experience. And I've gotten through the majority of it on the other side, and I'm a much happier and healthier person, I feel, for it. But just that utter loss of self and the kind of the terrifying feeling of like, are the people around me still going to like me? Right. Because I'm not who they thought I was, or who I, was at the time. Like such a large component of myself, I feel, has changed. What part of myself were they attracted to? So a lot of those ideas and insecurities and fears I put into Evie, at least to start, right? I'm not telling her story. Her story is not about religion. Her story is not my story, but that emotional connection and that, how do I find who I am anymore? I think plays a lot into her character to make her vulnerable and hopefully empathetic in that way to those who've had some sort of similar experience, either on her similar scale or my similar scale or not. I think we all, as we grow up, have that moment where we have to kind of stand on our own 2 feet and figure out who we are and where we're going to go.
Yeah, I think you do that really well. And it's funny because there's like actually one very specific beat from the second issue that I am just going to completely and utterly spoil. It is not a big thing. I feel like this is a totally fine thing to say, but
no, go for it.
It is kind of related to identity and everything you're talking about. There is like at the beginning of the second issue, there's an existential conversation about kill salad in a dream. In like it's in which Evie questions why kale salad is her favorite food. And the funny thing about that scene is when I first read that Evie's character or Evie's favorite food was kale salad, I was immediately like, what is wrong with her? Like, whose favorite food is kale salad? And it was funny because on the next page, she herself was questioning why kale salad is her favorite food. It's funny because, like, thematically, it actually ties into what you were just saying. But I really just want to talk about it because I love that scene because it, like, literally mirrored my thought process as I was reading it. I was like, is Philip reading my mind and creating as I'm reading this? What is happening?
Oh, well, good. I'm glad it connected both, on a visceral level and as a thematic level too. Because I'm the same way. I'm like, kale just tastes like dirty vegetables. I don't know why, but so many people just love it. So
I've had some pretty good dishes with kale in it. I can't imagine like kale salad being my favorite food. I had a really amazing. There was like a breakfast scramble that had kale in it and like
okay,
with some like it had like a vinaigrette of some sort, which are two things I wouldn't normally think would be great in a breakfast food, but it was actually excellent. So time and place, but like kale salad, I was just like, wow, this Evie's going through something because her favorite food is kale salad. I'm like, I'm really getting this right now. Well, the last thing with Triage I want to talk about was something you actually mailed me. You mailed me some Triage cards that you created to promote the books. Or to promote the book. You and I both love the Marvel cards back in the day. You actually were handing out Marvel Masterpieces packs I think it was Marvel Masterpieces at Emerald City this year. Why did you want to make those to promote the comic? And then on top of that, I mean, like, do you feel like thematically that ties into, like, not thematically, but like your drive to evoke a certain amount of nostalgia with this book?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think drive is like I have so many Marvel 90s cards around me all the time because like about every 6 months I just haphazardly click into eBay and buy like a whole 4 more sets of like the same thing I have because I have impulse control issues when it relates to things that I love so much.
Sure.
So I was like, man, wouldn't it be cool to have your own trading cards? And then, I was thinking about kind of promotional tools. A lot of creators will do like postcards and send them, and it's got like a couple cool images and the order code. And I'm like, that's a great idea. But I'm like, but I see those stacked on countertops of so many stores. And I'm like, I don't know if they are as effective a tool as we could utilize in order to kind of promote a work. And then it was just like, I'm looking at X-Men Series 1 cards sitting next to me. And I was like, you know what? There's got to be people out there like me who would think it would be just so cool to get kind of a throwback trading card. I kicked it around and was like, you know what, I'm just going to do it. So I think I had printed 4,000 of them because 4,000 was just about the same amount to do 400 once you hit a certain number. I've designed them with X-Men and Marvel Universe Series trading cards at the side of me. They've got power ratings, they've got quotes, they've got little background on each character that you won't find necessarily in the book. So a fun world building tool. I think it very much ties into kind of that sense of nostalgia and excitement I'm trying to elicit in the book outside of just, trying to tell the best story that I can. I've got them. I've started to send them to retailers. Like if people hear this and they want some, like let me know or let your retailer know. Just get in contact with me. I'll send a bunch. Like there's so many retailers, and I'm doing everything on this book. So I'm like I only have so much time, which is like again kind of stupid if I'm doing every role, but I don't have as much time as I want to promote the book. I make lots of interesting choices sometimes. But if you guys want some, let me know. Like I would love to send your store cards. I'll have them with me at cons, and just until I get rid of them all, like I want to kind of spread the love this way.
The thing I really love about it though is like when you sent the cards to me and I opened the envelope and there was like the hunter card in there, your power ratings were like really quick shorthand to being like, oh my God, this guy is the real deal. This guy is a problem. All sevens? No, no, sir.
So I've got a 7-year-old son, and just this year, as I'm working on Triage, he's finally, I don't know if it's finally clicked what I do, or it's something that he's interested in now, and he will just like stand over my shoulder, literally breathing on my neck as I'm drawing all the time, and just be asking me all sorts of questions. And I think a lot of it is because I gave him these trading cards, and he is a kid who just like super analytical, super logical, and loves to read and absorb information. And he sat with these trading cards for days, just reading them. And it bothers him so much that Hunter has like number 7 off the chart ratings on everything. And the back of the card says nothing is known about Hunter at this time. And it just, he's like, why do we not know anything? Why does he have 7 mental powers? He should have like a 3. How are they going to defeat him? He is way too strong. Like, he is seriously concerned, and we've had many discussions about Hunter's power ratings. So I'm like, well, a new generation is connecting with these the way we did cards back in the day.
Well, I mean, honestly, like that's the type of stuff you need to get people excited. It's just like, why is it like this? I mean, I remember. So, I mean, I'm sure you have the Marvel Universe Series 3 cards where they had like,
yes,
like those ones. That was one of my favorite sets, and like my favorite card from that entire set. And I've referenced this on the podcast like a million times. The Celestials are like their power rating is not applicable because they like break the scale. And I was always I remember when I was a kid, I was just like, what is the deal with the Celestials? How could they break the power ratings? They made the power ratings. There's no reason why they should be able to be like counted. This is ridiculous. It like broke the concept of stats that they were so powerful. And so it was funny because I was kind of like your kid in that sense, because I always wanted to know more about the Celestials, because I couldn't even fathom the concept of somebody who was so strong that they broke the scale of the power ratings on these cards.
Yeah, no, I'm the same way. I love that something that makes your imagination or makes you think beyond or outside of the story. And I think it's one of the things I'm trying. I think everyone tries this, right? But like, how much information can I give to make the story effective, and how much can I hold back so that it just leaves people thinking about things that we didn't say, like between the lines, or what's the world around them. I don't want to leave things in such a way where it's like frustrating and annoying that there's questions, but the type of questions that inspire, like, not necessarily fanfic, because I don't need fanfic on my thing, but like something where someone's like, I have to think about this and I have to figure it out. Like, that's the stuff that made me excited as a comic reader. And then, anything, I think so many TVs and movies have essentially become comic books these days, and as far as the stretches of the imagination and the serialized connectivity, but there's something that's just pure about a comic that's just trying to be a comic. And I think that's what excites me about this book.
Yeah. And I will say that like one thing that, when you and I were growing up and you're reading like X-Men comics, there was something to be said about like, it actually made me more excited to not know something, because then I had to try to figure it out. And it was like, I don't know who Cable is in relation to all these people. And then I like start figuring out, I'm like, this is wild. This is like straight insane. Like, I honestly, like, I love the X-Men. I honestly don't know if I've ever read a comic that had Baby Nathaniel in it, which is kind of funny. I mean, besides like the Slim and Red, like a scanny. Yeah, besides that book. But it's funny because it's like, I've never read that, but I know that exists because of context, because of the stories. And it's just kind of funny because it's like those books actually, those comics actually, I feel like challenged me to be a different type of reader, and it makes me excited to not know things in comics, which is kind of a weird thing, but it totally works.
Yeah, it does. I think the conversation comes back a lot from a marketing standpoint, like, we have to start number 1 so people feel like it's accessible. Like, no one wants to buy an issue 300 and try and figure out what went on before then. And I challenged that. Like, my first, obviously, X-Men number 1 was the first thing I bought, but the next thing I ran out was Uncanny X-Men like 302 and then 303. Like, I loved trying to figure out like the backgrounds of these characters, and I scoured trading cards and Wizard magazines and Marvel Universe encyclopedias, and like the challenge of piecing together this information was so much fun. And I feel, it's not the answer to solve everything, but I think if we push to make content so engaging that we like can't stop thinking about it, then I think that would help bridge the gap of worried about attracting new readers. Like, make people want to read and want to think about your books. And I think, I think most creators are. I'm not saying they're not, but I think maybe a different kind of, I mean, we've talked offline a lot about it, but like, Jonathan Hickman's new X-Men books, like those books, I'm like, I want to know what's happening because there's not the answers in issue 1. And I've seen some people complain, like, I just want all the answers on issue 1. And I was like, please go away, because I don't want all my answers in issue 1. I want to buy the next issue. I want to like have this crazy, like, I've got to figure this out type obsession with a book. I love books like that so much.
Yeah, this is a perfect transition because I was planning on ending with this anyways. I want to just do a couple of quick minutes on House of X and Powers of X. And just forewarning for everyone, I'm going to go full spoiler on this. I don't even really think it counts as full spoiler because I feel like everyone in comics is reading this. But I think the amazing thing of House of X and Powers of X is, I mean, besides the fact that they are phenomenal comics, and R.B. Silva and Pepe Larraz are just like killing it on these books. I mean, it's ridiculous.
And Marte Gracia on colors is just
yeah. And then the data pages from Tom Muller. I mean, just they're such phenomenal like books. But
yes,
I think like you were saying, like these books do such a good job of like getting people excited about the unknown again. I mean, like the amount of speculation that's happening from comic fans about what's happening in this is just so exciting to me. Like, I just love a comic where people are excited about like the story and what's to come rather than like, I don't know. I feel like this is the first comic in a while where people are getting really hyped about that.
Yeah, very much so. And I think a lot of they've done a really good job promoting and marketing the book in a really way that makes you want to know, instead of having a press release 3 days before that says Catwoman leaves Batman at the altar. You're like, oh, why would I read that comic then? I just found out the punchline. In this one, I'm like, I don't know the punchline. Like, who is this silver girl with a big ass sword? Like, what are all these things mean? Like, they did such a good job leading up that way. And then Hickman just does a phenomenal job of like, he just sets a gigantic generation spanning stage in 2 issues and is like, all right, this is what we're going to do for the next X amount of years. And I'm just 100% all in.
Yeah, when they announced it at San Diego, they were like, "Oh yeah," Hickman, I think it was, that said that there's like a 30-year plan, and I was like, "Ha ha ha, funny joke, Jonathan." And I read it, and I'm like, "Oh my god, he was being serious."
Yes, no, this is Jonathan Hickman we're talking about. If anyone can pull off a 30-year plan, I'll give it to him.
Yeah, but I mean, like the ideas in it are just so exciting. I mean, like even like the character reveals in Powers of X, like the X to 100 years in the future stuff. Oh, yeah, like with like Cardinal, like and all the Chimera mutants and everything like that. Mm-hmm. All those ideas are so rad. Although they are like fundamentally couched on trusting Mr. Sinister, which is just a hilariously bad idea.
And they even say that in one of the data pages, like, Pop, as Mr. Sinister always does, he betrayed everyone and killed everything, and you're like, yep.
Yeah, you're like, anybody could have seen this coming. But I mean, like, there was like the bit when they're in like the Ileana kind of Chimera type character, and then in Cardinal when they both, God, what is the name of Ileana, the Ileana one?
It's a Rasputin, actually.
It's just Rasputin, yeah. So Rasputin,
yep.
And Cardinal go into like the Krakoa, the Black Room, whatever they call that, from like that they introduced in House of X, that concept. And like they go there, and there's like Magneto and Wolverine and like Zorn, and I'm trying to remember who the 4th person is.
Oh yeah, who is that 4th person? Yeah, no, but it's like green Magneto. It looks like Polaris Magneto.
Right. And you're just like,
old Wolverine, and
yeah, like, is this actually Magneto? I mean, like, all those things. Like, it's just funny. It's like you could take any part of that and just post it on social media, and every single person would be like, "What is happening? I have to know the answers to this because it's so insane."
Yeah, I remember reading just kind of the opening page of Powers of X, where I'm pulling it up right now just to get it right, but it's like year 1, year 10, year 100, and year 1000, and each has their own like title. And I literally had to if I was reading digitally, I had to put my phone down and just be like, oh my gosh. And so many pages in both Powers, but especially both House and especially Powers, where they play with different stages in time and different concepts and all this stuff that to me, I love the X-Men for. It just, every page I had to drop it. Or like the conversation between Moira and Charles, where Charles doesn't know her, but she knows him, and then he reads her mind, and like, Yes, there's just so much like I need to know what happens next, and I love that so much.
I realize I'm doing it again. Powers of 10. It's not Powers of X. What am I doing? Powers of 10. I know that makes a substantial difference. But yeah, you know, and the Moira scene was really interesting because like that was the one that they touted as like the most important scene in X-Men history. And the funny thing is when I read it, I was like, why is this the most important scene in X-Men history? And then I was like, wait a second. That's what he's trying to do. Now they're getting like all hyped up. They use the hype to build that, and now we have to find out the answer later on. I mean, it's like it's really fascinating because it's like a perfect blend of like active gratification and like delayed gratification. I don't know. I mean, it's really smart. And the last thing I want to say just is like a really quick touting. Man, how good was RB Silva's Nimrod? I mean,
oh yeah,
like it's the most gestural robot that's ever existed in the history of the world, and also like what a weirdly charming murder robot.
Yeah, this is my favorite I've ever seen Nimrod. And he just like his size and scale, but like just the moment where he like puts his hands to his chest, like and he gets so excited, he has a grin on his face. I was like, I kind of love this, and I want like a plush Nimrod now.
Oh boy.
The other character in that Krakoan Black Room or whatever is like Groot Krakoa.
Oh yeah,
he's like the tall tree guy. We don't quite know, but yeah, that's who the fourth one was. I had to pull it up because it was driving me nuts.
Well, and they're also going to meet two other people, like the other, because there's 8 total, and we don't know who those 2 other people are. Man,
oh yeah,
I'm gonna like it's funny because every time a new issue comes out, which is literally every week, like I'm like having to mute all the words because in Alaska my shop doesn't open until noon, and I'm like a pure print reader, and so. I will like I don't want it to be spoiled, but I mean it is really astonishing. And also like the other thing I want to compliment them on is I wasn't sure how the House of X and Powers of 10 interplay was really going to work, but it was kind of amazing how quickly they tied that in and how much they made it make sense. Like it's just it's real. It's so smartly done.
You know, and I also love too that right from the start, Powers of 10 you can tell like picks up right where House of X leaves off, but also it very clearly defines itself as a different story.
Right.
Like, obviously, I'm going to read them, as like part 1 and 2 of each other, but you can tell like House is a little bit more about what's happening now and redefining that world, and Powers plays more with kind of the cosmic grand scale, different spots in the timeline aspect of X-Men. They're 2 books that very much play to the strength of X-Men, but also feel like they're not regressive in any way. And not that regressive isn't always bad. Like I love nostalgia comics, obviously, but I love kind of like it felt like I was reading Grant Morrison's New X-Men when I picked up House, and not because it was the same story, but because it felt like, oh, we're advancing the metaphor, or we're talking about things in a new way. We're not revisiting kind of the way we've set up X-Men forever.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I can keep talking about this forever, but I'm going to let you go. I know it's getting a little bit later there. Phillip, thank you so much for coming on, talking Triage, talking X-Men, talking about your life story with comics. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, no, thank you, man, so much. It's been an absolute blast and an honor to be on the show.
Before we go, I want to give a special shout out to Sean Kirkham, aka Big Clutch, one of Off Panel's patrons, in another edition of Big Clutch's Beast of the Week, where I highlight a creator or comic that blew me away recently. This week, I'm going to highlight the team of Paper Girls, who ended their run with the title's 30th issue. Ending a comic is hard, but this one was absolutely perfect. Brian K. Vaughan, Cliff Chang, Matt Wilson, and Jared K. Fletcher completely and utterly nailed not just a fitting conclusion for the title, but if I'm being honest, perhaps more importantly for me, just what I wanted from the series. It was a lovely goodbye to the core cast that managed to deliver on not everything that was set up before. Plus, oh my god, what a ridiculous art team Chang and Wilson are. It was gorgeous. So shout out to the team behind Paper Girls, this week's pick for Big Clutch's Beast of the Week. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with cartoonist Phillip Sevy. You can find Phillip on Twitter at Phillip Sevy, his website at phillipsevy.com, and in the upcoming Triage from Dark Horse Comics. As a heads up, Off Panel is once again brought to you by Sketch.com. Check out the new version of the site and consider subscribing for access to all the site's content and its members-only forum. If you're a fan of Off Panel, make sure to check it out on Patreon. If you back the show on there, you not only support it, but you get early access to each week's podcast, access to weekly content, and more. Also, don't forget to subscribe to Off Panel on iTunes or Spotify and give the show a rating or review while you're at it. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by liking it on Facebook at /Sketched. That's SKTCHD. Follow it on Twitter at SketchComic or following me at @SliceFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Nathan House, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Troy Jeffrey Allen, Leona Kangas, Keegan Ray, Milton Lawson, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Harry Small, Alistair Ross, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Ryanwan, Connor Farner, Beata Ayala, JDC and Matt Gagnon, Aditya Bidikar, Tara Ferguson, Dave Slusher, Kieran Mark Antonio, WMQ Comics, Akil, Kokachi, Phil White, Ben Becker, Sean Pinello, Kent Heidelman, Phillip Sevy, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, Nick Michelin, David Kelly, Robert Wilson IV, Nick Polito, Owen McCready, Brendan Fletcher, Gary Maloney, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogert, Xavier Files, Maria Schweitzer, Matthew Taylor, Tyler Turner, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Braldy, Ira James Udaskin, Modern Magic Stories, Nick Hall, Bobby Ingus, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Phil Nall, Ian Maxwell, Cliff Chang, Benjamin Shipper, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Greg Rucka, Adam Highfield, Nicholas Gardner, Fiona Staples, Chris O'Halloran, Mark Abnett, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonacos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's theme song just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.